Hi, this is Justin Coletti of Sonic Scoop. Thanks for joining me for this week's episode of the Sonic Scoop podcast. And today I'm going to be giving you my 3 biggest takeaways from watching Luca Pretolesi do the first MixCon 2020 presentation right here on Sonic Scoop. In case you missed it, definitely check it out. Luca did 40 to 50 minutes on his approach to music production, mixing, particularly in the electronic and EDM genres. But I think there's a ton of takeaways out there if you're doing hip hop, even if you're doing rock and pop music, because my 3 biggest takeaways from Luca, even though he works in these genres where the low end is so important, my biggest takeaways are about how he handles the mid-range. And I think he had some really interesting, crucial insights there. Again, I'd recommend you check out the full MixCon masterclass from Luca right here on the Sonic Scoop channel and in the MixCon playlist, and the live Q&A I just did with him afterwards. There's more MixCon presentations coming out every week for the next 6 weeks here in September and October of 2020. So definitely check those out. Make sure you hit like and subscribe and hit that notifications bell so you don't miss any more of the amazing MixCon presentations coming up. In case you're not familiar with Luca, he's a really great mixing and mastering engineer. He's been nominated for Grammys 3 times. He's worked with a whole bunch of artists, particularly in the genres of electronic and EDM and even hip hop, and artists you've probably heard of like Major Lazer, Prince Royce, Glass Animals, 2 Chainz, Snoop Lion, Jeremiah, a whole bunch of really big, successful records. And I think he had some really incredible insights to share. I'm going to give you my 3 big takeaways from Luca, starting with number 1, that he thinks of his mix almost like a tree from the low end to the high end when it comes to width. So this is interesting. There was this idea of a tree blossoming with his mix, where he's thinking about certain components being a little bit more narrow in the stereo field and certain components being wider in the stereo field. So he might have low frequencies that are fairly narrow in their left to right dispersion, but then as he gets higher and higher up into the mid-range, things start to go further and further out left and right. And then as we get to the tippy top of that tree, things start to close back in a little bit at the very highest frequencies. So I thought that was a really interesting way of thinking about things. If you're doing mastering work, you can do these kinds of things with some multi-band processors that work on the left-right spectrum. So you can have multi-band stereo spreaders. I actually use a multi-band stereo spreader from Isotope in all the masters I do, but you can also have this kind of thinking inform your mixing in addition to informing your mastering. The idea of having low end that's more mono, mid-range that's more spread out, and then very tippity top end that becomes more mono again. He goes into so much more detail in his MixCon presentation about that idea, but I think that was one really cool key takeaways and one of my favorite analogies from his presentation. There's a couple more focused on the mid-range that I want to tell you about that I think are even more insightful and interesting than this one. But before we get there, what do I have to do? The briefest of shout-outs to our sponsors. I do want to mention that Luca's presentation was sponsored by SonarWorks because he uses SonarWorks on every single one of the mixes that he does, specifically, especially to correct his headphones and make them as flat as possible because he references on headphones on every mix that he does. And even though he has a pair of like $1,500 headphones, very nice ones from Focal, he still finds they benefit from SonarWorks. So they were big sponsors on his presentation, made it free for the public, but also big thanks to Soundtoys, sponsoring this podcast from the beginning. You can try out anything they make for free at soundtoys.com, some of my favorite creative mixing effects. Another big shout out to Focusrite, making some of my favorite interfaces around. Focusrite, we're just completing a giveaway with them. It's ending today, so definitely check that out, and we'll have the new MixCon mega giveaway up soon at the Sonic Scoop website, so definitely check us out, sonicscoop.com, and big thanks to Focusrite for doing yet another giveaway with us, making some of the best bang for the buck interfaces out there. Last but not least, Steinberg, making some of the coolest DAWs and other software, things like Cubase, Nuendo, the music notation system, Dorico, and making great interfaces and stuff in their own right as well. All right, right back on track with my other key takeaways from Luca's presentation. Big takeaway number 2 for me from Luca's presentation was that he likes to compress his mid-range more than his lows and his highs. And he does this in his buses by using a sidechain. A lot of people, when they hear sidechain, they're thinking of sidechain being like a ducking kind of thing, where you might duck down a guitar part when a kick drum hits, or duck down the kick drum when the bass is playing, that kind of thing. Duck down a bass part when the kick hits. Those are conventional ways that we think about sidechaining, making sure that when a snare hits, you're ducking down your pads. But the way he uses a sidechain is more like an EQ curve going into his bus processing. So his main bus compressors aren't responding to the low end or very high end elements in his mix. Instead, his bus process gets this radically EQ'd, super mid-rangey version of the mix. And that is what his main bus processing is reacting to. And he lets you hear that soloed in his presentation. I think it's another interesting thing about having your compression be focused really on the mid-range content. So he's creating a custom EQ curve of the mix that the main bus compressors and limiters are going to be reacting to. And I thought that was a wonderful, insightful thing. Thing number 3 about the mid-range. And I'll tell you what, I'm going to give you a bonus 4th one, so stand by for that. But thing number 3 for the mid-range is that he likes to get rid of some low end, often from things like kick and bass. And one of the first elements he brought up in his presentation for us was a kick drum, where he shaved off some of the low end of that kick drum. He had a really, really steep low cut EQ on his low end. And he had that going on at one specific frequency in his kick. He'll also do that kind of thing on bass, other elements. Because getting big thumping, club thumping low end isn't necessarily about putting heaps and gobs of 20 hertz and 30 hertz and 40 hertz and all this stuff into the master necessarily. Because those aren't actually the frequencies that are going to help you hear a kick drum or hear a bass. And a lot of the definition of your kick and bass comes from the mid-range. And getting that part right is exceptionally important in getting good sounding low end. And for him, some of the very lowest stuff is sometimes just making bus processing freak out, clipping converters, clipping, other elements in both his analog and digital chain. And if he can get rid of just a tiny little bit of low end, he can get the track to sound louder and cleaner. And ultimately, to feel like it has bigger bass than other tracks, because the whole track is a little bit louder without sounding distorted. And because that kick drum and that bass now have more definition. He's focusing a little bit more on making them audible in the mid-range, making sure that you have enough bass in the low end, and making sure you compare that to other records to make sure it's a ton, but making sure you don't have so much. And this is something I run into a lot with new mixers who send me tracks to master for them for the first time, is sometimes they'll have way more low end than they realize on their tracks. And I can help make their low end sound bigger by containing some of the low end that's there in their tracks. So I think that's another absolutely huge takeaway, is that sometimes you can get bigger low end that speaks better and that sounds louder by getting rid of a little bit of the low end. Does this mean always low cut and high pass every single kick drum and every single bass and every single instrument? No. But it does mean don't be afraid to do that. And know what you're hearing. And this was another big 4th bonus tip that I'm going to give you from talking to Luca. And it was about trusting your monitoring. So one of the most profound answers he gave for me when it comes to trusting what you're hearing came in response to a question someone asked on the live Q&A, where they asked him, hey, if you were poor or just starting out, how much money would you earmark towards speakers? And he made a distinction I've made so many times, and it was so great to hear him say it, was that he wouldn't put all of his money into speakers, even though monitoring is so important. It's not necessarily the greatest thing to have super expensive speakers in an untreated room. And the better treated your room is, the more you're going to get the most out of any set of speakers. And the less well treated your room is, the more important it is to make sure your speakers are placed in the right way in the room to make sure you're not thrown off on low end. And he also brought up that idea that I try to talk to you guys about again and again, of using references to make sure that your low end is sitting properly. Because some people make things sound great to them in the studio, and they take it out of their studio environment and it just sounds wrong. And this is something that you can fix to a degree by listening to great music, at least sometimes back to back with your own mixes. So you can hear what the low end sounds like on a great track right next to your track. And that can help you learn a system, particularly as you're getting started, particularly as you're learning the ins and outs of a new room. So he definitely harps on that idea. And he also throws out the idea again of SonarWorks being potentially one of those things you can do to kind of flatten things out in addition to acoustic treatment and things like that. So just like I've said in the past, you don't want to just have a speaker budget. You want to have a monitoring budget that thinks about things like room treatment and potentially EQing. I know I said I was going to give you just 3. I ended up giving you 4, but I want to give you a 5th. And this is Luca's approach to mastering. He's one of these rare people who mixes and masters his own recordings at a very high level, where he'll serve as the mixing engineer and the mastering engineer on a release for some pretty big tracks. And although you find a lot of bedroom, producers and hobbyists doing this kind of thing where they're both mixing and mastering their own tracks, it's not super common at a high level, although it is a little bit more common in Luca's genre, which is more electronic and EDM focused. But Luca makes sure that he puts on a different hat when he mixes and a different hat when he does mastering. And this is something that I hammer home in my course, Mastering Demystified, and in my free workshop on mastering, Mastering 101. It was so great to hear him do it and say the same thing. If you are going to both mix and master the same track that you've mixed, it makes sense to do those as 2 separate stages. And this is something Luca said that he does. When he's mixing, he finishes mixing. He says, I'm done. I'm closing down the session. And now I'm going to take off my mixing engineer hat where I think about mixing things. And I'm going to come back to that track later on with the mindset of a mastering engineer, which is a totally different mindset. A mindset that's not focused on changing level balances. A mindset that's not focused on perfecting that kick drum and getting the right effect on the vocal. No, a mindset where we zoom out and we think about the overall tonal balance and shape and color of this track, how it compares to other tracks in the album, how it compares to other tracks out there in the world in the same genre. And then if he needs to do mix revisions, he almost write himself notes like he's a client of his and say, hey, here are the things you need to go back and fix in the mix. Go do those things in the mix. And then we'll come back for another mastering session when you have a new mix. And he makes sure to really separate those 2 processes. So he has a mixing process and a separate mastering process, even if he's the one doing both of those things, mixing and mastering. If you want to hear this stuff in a lot more detail and you want to hear everything that Luca went into, check out the main presentations. Go check out the latest MixCon video right there on the Sonic Scoop YouTube channel. You can get us at sonicscoop.com. You can get us on youtube.com/sonicscoopvideo. That's youtube.com/sonicscoopvideo. Check us out at sonicscoop.com. Make sure that you hit that like and notifications bell so you don't miss any of this great stuff that we've got coming for you. New MixCon videos every single week. Big shout out to our sponsors, SonarWorks, Sound Toys, making some of my favorite creative mixing effects, Focusrite, making some killer interfaces, and last, certainly not least, Steinberg, makers of Cubase and Nuendo, some of the most powerful DAWs out there. This has been Justin Coletti of Sonic Scoop. If you want more with me, you can get some of my free workshops like the 5 Habits of Truly Great Mixers at sonicscoop.com/mixhabits. That's sonicscoop.com/mixhabits, or Mastering 101 at sonicscoop.com/mastering 101. Thanks for hanging out with me. This has been Justin Coletti of Sonic Scoop. See you next time.